It was the summer of 2016, and I had just turned 28. My cousin Sarah, who was a year younger than me, suggested we rent a cabin for a weekend getaway in northern Minnesota. She'd found a small, secluded place on the edge of a forest near a lake. Sarah loved the outdoors and had always been drawn to quiet, off-the-grid locations. I wasn't as adventurous, but I liked the idea of a peaceful weekend, so I agreed. Sarah's boyfriend, Jake, was a cop and had planned to join us later that night after his shift. It seemed like a good balance. A quiet escape with a bit of added security once Jake arrived. We drove up on a Friday morning, the summer heat pressing down on us as we wound our way through dense forests and narrow dirt roads. The cabin sat about half a mile from the nearest paved road, surrounded by towering pines and thick underbrush. It was small but cozy, with a single bedroom, a living room that doubled as a kitchen, and a tiny bathroom. The best feature was the porch overlooking the lake. The first day passed quietly. We unpacked, explored the area a bit, and sat by the lake as the sun dipped below the horizon. It felt good to be away from the noise of the city. By dusk, Sarah and I were sitting on the porch, drinking iced tea and watching the fireflies blink in and out across the water. When it got dark, we moved inside. There wasn't much to do without internet or TV, so we played a few card games before heading to bed. Jake had texted Sarah that he'd be late. His shift was running longer than expected, but she didn't seem too worried. I fell asleep quickly, but something woke me up around 2 a.m. At first, I thought it was the sound of Jake arriving, but when I listened closer, I realized it wasn't a car. It was a faint rustling, like something moving outside. The cabin was silent except for the occasional creak of the wooden walls. I lay still, straining to hear. The sound was faint, but it seemed to be coming from behind the cabin, near the treeline. Could have been an animal, I told myself, maybe a raccoon or a deer. Still, it unsettled me enough that I couldn't go back to sleep. I got up and checked the windows. The moonlight was bright enough to illuminate the yard, but I didn't see anything unusual. The woods stood dark and silent, the lake a still mirror reflecting the sky. I told myself to calm down and climbed back into bed. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept imagining the sound of footsteps outside, the feeling of being watched. Morning came, and with it, a sense of relief. In the daylight, the cabin felt safe again. Sarah was already up, making coffee. I didn't mention the noises from the night before. She'd probably laugh it off anyway. We spent the day hiking around the lake and taking pictures. Sarah loved photography and kept stopping to snap shots of the trees, the water, and the occasional bird. By the time we got back to the cabin, we were both tired and ready to relax. Jake called around dinner time to say he was on his way, but it would be late, probably after midnight. He apologized, but Sarah brushed it off. She was used to his unpredictable hours. After dinner, we sat by the lake again, this time with a small fire going in the fire pit. The stars were incredible, brighter than I'd ever seen them. Sarah talked about her plans for the next day, maybe renting a canoe, exploring further up the lake. Around 10 p.m., we went back inside. Sarah went to bed almost immediately, but I stayed up, flipping through an old magazine I'd found in the cabin. The hours crept by, and by midnight, I was starting to get sleepy. That's when I heard it again. The same rustling noise from the night before, but this time it was closer. My heart started pounding as I strained to listen. It wasn't an animal, it was too deliberate, too steady. I turned off the lamp and moved to the window, peeking out through the curtains. The yard was empty, but the noise continued, coming from the side of the cabin near the trees. I debated waking Sarah, but decided against it. Instead, I grabbed the flashlight we'd left by the door and stepped outside. The air was cool and still, the only sound the occasional chirp of crickets. I shone the light around the yard but saw nothing. Then, just as I was about to head back inside, I caught a glimpse of movement near the treeline. My breath caught as I focused the beam. For a moment, I thought it was a person, but it was too quick, disappearing into the shadows before I could get a good look. I backed up toward the cabin, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I set the flashlight down. I told myself it had to be a trick of the light, maybe an animal startled by the beam. But deep down, I didn't believe it. I stayed up, listening, but the noise didn't return. When Jake arrived around 1 a.m., I felt a wave of relief. The next morning, I told Sarah and Jake about what I'd seen. Jake checked around the property but didn't find anything unusual. No footprints, no signs of disturbance. He brushed it off as nerves, and Sarah seemed to agree. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That afternoon, we decided to hike further into the woods. Sarah wanted to find a good spot to take pictures, and Jake wanted to scout the area just in case. The forest was dense, the trees blocking out most of the sunlight. It was beautiful but eerie, the kind of place where you felt like you were being watched. We didn't see anyone else on the trail, but there were moments when I thought I heard footsteps behind us, just faint enough to make me doubt myself. When we got back to the cabin, I was exhausted. I told Sarah and Jake I was going to take a nap while they went down to the lake. I woke up to the sound of something banging against the cabin. It was loud, violent, like someone trying to break down the door. I jumped out of bed, my heart racing. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the room. I could hear Jake yelling, his voice muffled but frantic. I ran to the living room and saw Jake at the door, holding it shut with all his strength. Sarah was standing behind him, pale and shaking. "Call 911, Jake shouted, and I realized I hadn't brought my phone. Neither had Sarah. The banging stopped suddenly, and the silence was almost worse. Jake waited a few seconds before carefully opening the door. The yard was empty. We didn't sleep that night. Jake stayed up, his gun on the table, while Sarah and I huddled on the couch. By morning, we decided to leave. We packed up quickly, not bothering to eat breakfast. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Weeks later, Sarah sent me a news article about a man who'd been arrested for breaking into cabins in the area. He was armed and dangerous, suspected of multiple crimes. It still haunts me to think about how close we came to being one of his victims. It was a chilly autumn morning when my family decided to take a weekend trip to a remote cabin in the woods. The idea had been my wife's, something to get us all away from the screens and constant noise of city life. I wasn't thrilled at first, but the thought of spending time with my kids and our golden retriever, Max, sounded like a peaceful change. My son, Ethan, was 12, and my daughter, Lily, was 9. Both were excited about the idea of hiking, roasting marshmallows, and exploring the outdoors. Max, as always, was just happy to be with us. The cabin was tucked deep in the forest, about 4 hours from our home in Minnesota. We rented it online, and the listing described it as a cozy escape surrounded by pristine wilderness. Sounded perfect. I loaded up the SUV with supplies: food, flashlights, extra blankets, and Max's bed and leash. We left early Friday morning, the kids dozing in the back seat while Max sat between them, panting with excitement. The drive was uneventful for the first couple of hours. As we neared the forest, the roads became narrower and bumpier. Cell service faded away, replaced by towering pine trees and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. The GPS struggled to keep up, and eventually, we relied on printed directions provided by the cabin's owner. We arrived just before noon. The cabin was smaller than I had imagined, but it looked charming. It had a stone chimney, a small front porch with a pair of rocking chairs, and a fire pit out front. The forest surrounded it on all sides, thick and dense, making it feel like we were in the middle of nowhere. I unpacked the car while the kids ran around, exploring the area. Max darted after them, his tail wagging furiously. The air was crisp and clean with the faint scent of pine. For a moment, I felt at ease. After settling in, we spent the afternoon hiking a nearby trail. The forest was beautiful, the ground covered in a carpet of golden and red leaves. Max stayed close, occasionally stopping to sniff at something before bounding ahead to catch up with the kids. We didn't see a single soul on the trail, which felt strange but also added to the sense of isolation. Back at the cabin, I lit a fire in the fireplace while my wife prepared dinner. The kids played a board game at the kitchen table, and Max lay at their feet, chewing on a stick he'd found outside. After dinner, we roasted marshmallows over the fire pit. The stars above were brighter than I'd ever seen, the Milky Way stretching across the sky like a painting. When it was time to turn in, the kids slept in the loft upstairs, while my wife and I took the bedroom on the main floor. Max's bed was in the corner of our room, but he seemed restless, pacing near the door. I figured he was just excited from the day's activities and eventually coaxed him to lie down. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of Max growling softly. My wife was still asleep, and the room was pitch black except for the faint glow of the embers in the fireplace. I whispered his name, and he stopped growling but stayed alert, his ears perked up. I listened closely, straining to hear what had disturbed him. At first, there was nothing but the creaking of the cabin settling and the wind in the trees. Then, faintly, I heard it, a rustling sound, like footsteps crunching on dry leaves. It was coming from outside. I sat up, my heart pounding. Could have been a deer or some other animal, I told myself. But Max's growl returned, low and guttural. He rarely acted this way, and it put me on edge. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly made my way to the window. Peering through the glass, I scanned the dark forest but saw nothing. The sound had stopped. I stood there for a few moments, waiting, before convincing myself it was just the wind or an animal passing by. The next day, we decided to stay close to the cabin. The kids played near the fire pit while my wife and I cleaned up breakfast. Max seemed uneasy, sticking close to me and occasionally glancing toward the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling from the night before, but I didn't want to alarm anyone. In the afternoon, Ethan found something strange while exploring a bit further into the woods. It was an old campsite, long abandoned, with a torn tent and scattered belongings. There were no signs of who had been there or why they'd left in such a hurry. Ethan thought it was cool, but I felt uneasy. The forest suddenly seemed a lot less inviting. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sense of isolation grew stronger. The shadows lengthened, and the forest seemed to close in around us. I double-checked all the locks on the doors and windows before we went to bed. The sound came again that night, louder this time. It wasn't just rustling. It was deliberate, like someone walking slowly around the cabin. Max was growling again, standing by the bedroom door. I didn't wake my wife, not wanting to scare her. Instead, I grabbed the flashlight and my pocket knife and stepped into the living room. The footsteps stopped as soon as I moved. I stood there in the dark, flashlight in hand, waiting for something to happen. Minutes passed, and the only sound was my own breathing. Then, from the back of the cabin, came a sharp knocking sound. It wasn't at the door, it was on the wall. 3 deliberate knocks, then silence. I froze. Max barked, loud and aggressive, his tail straight and stiff. I moved toward the back window, but before I could reach it, there was another knock, this time on the opposite side of the cabin. It was as if someone or something was circling us, testing our reactions. The rest of the night was a blur. I stayed awake, knife in hand, while Max stayed alert by my side. Whatever or whoever was outside never tried to enter the cabin. The knocking eventually stopped, but the unease lingered. The next morning, I told my wife we were leaving. I didn't explain why, just that I didn't feel comfortable staying another night. She didn't argue, sensing my seriousness. As we packed up, I noticed something on the porch. There were muddy footprints, barefoot human footprints. They led from the woods to the cabin and then disappeared back into the trees. We left in a hurry, driving down the bumpy road until the forest thinned and cell service returned. I never reported what happened, and I've never been able to explain it. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that someone was watching us that weekend, someone who knew we were alone in the woods. The job wasn't exactly what I wanted, but it was what I needed. Bills were piling up, and the market wasn't kind to someone with limited experience. A night shift as a security guard at a small graveyard outside of town seemed harmless enough. It was quiet, the pay was decent, and I figured I could spend the time reading or scrolling through my phone. The graveyard wasn't one of those sprawling cemeteries. It was a modest plot surrounded by thick woods, with a small security cabin at the edge of the property. I remember my first night vividly. The year was 2012, and I was 25, fresh out of a string of odd jobs that didn't last. The security company handed me a flashlight, a radio, and a key to the cabin. The manager gave me a quick rundown during the day. Just patrol the grounds every hour, log any activity, and stay alert. The cabin had a tiny desk, a creaky chair, a coffee maker, and a small TV with an antenna that barely picked up any channels. I brought a thermos of coffee, a sandwich, and a book to pass the time. The shift started at 10 p.m., and I arrived a little early to get familiar with the place. The graveyard was bordered by a rusted chain-link fence, with a single gravel path weaving through the rows of headstones. Beyond the fence, the forest loomed, dark and silent. The cabin sat near the entrance, with a single yellow bulb above the door casting a weak glow. The first hour passed uneventfully. I made my initial patrol, walking the gravel path with my flashlight scanning the tombstones. The air was cold, and the only sounds were the crunch of gravel under my boots and the occasional rustling of leaves. I noted how the headstones varied. Some were simple slabs, while others were more elaborate, with crosses or angels etched into the stone. At 11 p.m., I returned to the cabin, logged the patrol in the record book, and poured myself a cup of coffee. The cabin was stuffy, with a faint smell of mildew. The small TV flickered with static, occasionally picking up snippets of a weather channel. I settled into the chair, thinking the night would drag on like this, slow and uneventful. But then, around midnight, I heard it, a faint sound, like gravel shifting underfoot. I froze, straining my ears. The noise came from somewhere near the center of the graveyard. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped outside, the cold biting at my face. The wind had picked up, making the tall pine trees sway and creak. I made my way down the path, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The sound stopped, and I was left with the eerie silence of the graveyard. I told myself it was probably an animal, a raccoon or a stray dog. Still, I walked the perimeter, shining the light into the shadows between the headstones. Nothing. Back in the cabin, I tried to shake off the unease. The radio crackled occasionally, but no one from the company called. I flipped through the channels on the TV, trying to find anything to distract me. The hours crawled by, and I did my next patrol at 1 a.m. This time, I noticed something odd. One of the gates on the far side of the graveyard was open. During the daytime walkthrough, the manager had specifically mentioned keeping all gates locked. The padlock was still hanging on the chain, unfastened. I secured the gate, double-checking the lock, and made a note of it in the logbook. By 2 a.m., the night felt heavier. The wind had died down, but the silence was oppressive. I started to hear noises again. Not just gravel shifting, but faint thuds, like something heavy being dropped. It was hard to pinpoint where it was coming from, but it sounded close. This time, I took my flashlight and the radio, leaving the cabin door slightly ajar. The air was colder than before, and a low mist had settled over the ground. My boots crunched on the gravel as I moved slowly, scanning the area. The thuds seemed to be coming from the northern corner of the graveyard, near an old oak tree that stood like a sentinel among the graves. As I approached, the beam of my flashlight caught something strange. One of the graves looked disturbed. The dirt wasn't freshly dug, but it was uneven, as if someone had been tampering with it. My stomach tightened. I crouched down, running the light over the area. The name on the headstone was worn, barely legible. I radioed the main office to report the disturbance, but the static was so bad I couldn't tell if they heard me. Deciding it was worth another look, I circled the area, keeping my light steady. That's when I noticed footprints, faint but distinct, leading away from the grave toward the woods. Every instinct told me to stay put, but I followed them. They led to the fence, where the underbrush was thick. I scanned the area but saw no one. The wind picked up again, and the trees groaned as if they were alive. When I returned to the cabin, my nerves were shot. I locked the door behind me and sat down, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The hours dragged on, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At 3 a.m., I decided to check the graveyard one last time. This time, it felt different. The mist was thicker, and the air seemed charged. As I walked the path, I felt a strange vibration underfoot, like a faint hum. Near the oak tree, the ground felt softer, almost spongy. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement, something darting between the headstones. I froze, listening. My breath was loud in the silence, and the faint thuds started again, this time closer. I shone the flashlight in the direction of the sound, and that's when I saw it. A figure stood near one of the larger headstones, barely visible in the mist. They didn't move, didn't react to the light. My heart raced as I called out, but there was no response. Taking a cautious step forward, I kept the light trained on them, and then they turned. Their face was partially obscured by the mist, but what I could see sent a chill through me. They weren't wearing a mask or a costume. This wasn't some prank. Their expression was blank, their eyes wide and unblinking. Before I could react, they bolted, disappearing into the woods. I didn't follow. Instead, I sprinted back to the cabin, locking the door and grabbing the phone. The line was dead. I spent the last few hours of my shift sitting in that cabin, clutching the flashlight and staring at the door. When dawn broke, the manager arrived to relieve me. I told him what happened, but he just frowned, saying the area was known for squatters. I quit that same day. I never went back, but sometimes I still dream about that graveyard. The uneven grave, the figure in the mist, and the feeling that I was never alone. The forest was dense and alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant birdsong. I'd been wandering for hours, following trails that had long since been swallowed by the wilderness. My plan had been simple: get away from the noise of the city for a few days and clear my head. I wasn't much of an outdoorsman, but I figured a rented cabin and a weekend alone in the woods couldn't hurt. The year was 2019, and I just turned 29. Life in Chicago had gotten overwhelming, and this seemed like the perfect escape. I'd found the listing for the cabin online. It was cheap, too cheap really, and about as remote as I could manage without needing to hike miles into the wilderness. It wasn't much more than a shack, but the pictures showed a solid roof, a functional fireplace, and enough privacy to make me feel truly alone. That was the point. The drive to this part of northern Wisconsin had been uneventful. I'd stocked up on groceries and basic supplies before leaving town. making sure I had enough to last the weekend. The directions were clear, but the final stretch of road leading to the cabin was little more than a dirt path overgrown with weeds. I'd parked my car at the edge of the property and carried my things the last 100 yards or so to the cabin. The place was rougher than I'd expected. The paint was peeling, the windows were smudged with dirt, and the front porch creaked ominously under my weight. Inside, it was just as rustic. A single room with a small kitchen area, a wood stove, and a cot in the corner. There was no electricity, just an old oil lamp and a stack of firewood against the wall. It smelled like damp wood and old mildew, but I didn't mind. I wasn't here for comfort. The first night passed uneventfully. I built a fire in the stove and heated up a can of soup while listening to the crackling flames. I'd brought a book to read but found myself staring out the window more often than not. The forest was pitch black, and the stillness outside was both calming and unnerving. I went to bed early, the weight of silence pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. The next day, I decided to explore. The forest surrounding the cabin was dense and untamed, with no clear paths to follow. I carried a small day pack with water, snacks, and my phone for navigation, though there was no signal this far out. The air was crisp and cold, the kind that makes your breath visible even in daylight. I wandered aimlessly, enjoying the solitude and the crunch of leaves underfoot. After a few hours, I stumbled upon something strange. An old, abandoned shed half hidden behind a cluster of pine trees. It looked even older than the cabin, with a sagging roof and walls covered in moss. I hesitated before approaching, my curiosity outweighing the unease creeping up my spine. The door hung ajar, revealing a dark interior filled with shadows. Inside, I found tools, rusted saws, axes, and other equipment that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. There were animal traps scattered across the floor, their metal jaws wide open and waiting. A stack of weathered crates sat in one corner, and on the far wall, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A row of hooks, each one stained with dark, dried streaks. I backed out of the shed quickly, my heart pounding. It was probably just an old hunting cabin, I told myself, though the image of those hooks stayed with me. I decided to head back to my cabin, feeling a growing sense of unease that I couldn't shake. That night, I struggled to sleep. The forest outside seemed louder than before, the rustling leaves and snapping branches taking on an almost menacing quality. I lay awake on the cot, staring at the ceiling and listening to every creak and groan of the cabin. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke up to the sound of something tapping on the window. I froze, my body rigid with fear. The tapping was slow and deliberate, like someone was testing the glass. I didn't dare move, my mind racing through possibilities. Could be a branch, I thought, or maybe an animal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The tapping stopped, and the silence that followed was deafening. I stayed motionless for what felt like hours, straining to hear anything else. When I finally worked up the courage to sit up, I grabbed the flashlight from my pack and shone it toward the window. There was nothing there, just the reflection of the room and the darkness beyond. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I decided to leave. The sense of unease had grown unbearable, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I packed my things quickly, eager to put as much distance between myself and the cabin as possible. But when I stepped outside, I stopped in my tracks. There were footprints in the dirt. They weren't mine. The prints were large and deep, leading from the forest to the cabin and back again. I followed them cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. They circled the cabin, stopping beneath each window before disappearing into the woods. Whoever had been outside last night hadn't been an animal. I didn't have a weapon, just a small pocket knife that felt laughably inadequate. Panic set in as I realized how vulnerable I was. The nearest town was miles away, and I had no way to call for help. I decided to follow the footprints into the forest, hoping to find some clue about who or what had been lurking outside. The trail led me deeper into the woods, where the trees grew thicker and the sunlight barely reached the ground. The prints eventually stopped at a clearing, where I found something that made my blood run cold. There was another cabin, larger than mine and in far worse condition. The windows were boarded up, and the door was reinforced with heavy planks of wood. I approached cautiously, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. The air around the cabin felt wrong, heavy with an unnatural stillness. As I got closer, I noticed a smell, foul and metallic, like rotting meat. I gagged, covering my mouth and nose with my sleeve. The door was slightly ajar, and against my better judgment, I pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was a nightmare. The walls were lined with shelves holding jars filled with unidentifiable objects suspended in murky liquid. Animal bones littered the floor, and in the center of the room was a wooden table stained with dark, sticky streaks. But it was the far corner that made me stumble back in horror. A pile of clothes, boots, and other personal belongings lay heaped against the wall. Among them was a backpack identical to the one I'd seen in my cabin's shed. I didn't wait to find out more. I turned and ran, crashing through the forest with no regard for the noise I was making. My only thought was to get back to my car and leave as fast as possible. When I reached my cabin, I didn't stop. I grabbed my keys, threw my bags into the car, and sped down the dirt path without looking back. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely keep the wheel steady. As I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, chasing me. But the road remained empty. By the time I reached the main highway, the forest was a distant memory, though the fear lingered like a shadow. I never reported what I saw. I couldn't explain it without sounding crazy, and part of me didn't want to know the truth. But sometimes, late at night, I think about those footprints and the cabin filled with horrors. I think about the hooks in the shed and the belongings piled in the corner. And I wonder if anyone else has rented that cabin since. It's been a year since I built the cabin. I was proud of it. A sturdy one-room structure nestled deep in the woods of northern Montana. It was meant to be my retreat, a place where I could escape the noise of the world and work with my hands. I spent months cutting timber, sanding boards, and assembling every joint. There was a sense of accomplishment in creating something with such permanence. The cabin was small but cozy, just enough room for a cot, a wood-burning stove, a workbench, and a shelf full of books. I didn't need much. The land around the cabin was thick with pines and birches, and the nearest town was over 20 miles away. That isolation was part of the appeal. By the time the first winter rolled in, I felt prepared. I had plenty of firewood stacked neatly by the door, supplies to last months, and enough tools to fix anything that went wrong. The snow started falling in mid-November, and by December it was knee-deep. I was alone, but I didn't mind. It was late January when things started to feel off. First, it was small things. I would hear faint sounds outside at night, like branches snapping or snow crunching. I told myself it was just animals, a deer or maybe a fox, but the sounds seemed too deliberate, too heavy. One morning, I stepped outside to check my firewood pile and noticed footprints in the snow. They weren't mine. They were larger, and the stride was longer than any animal I could think of. They led from the edge of the forest to the cabin and then back again, stopping just short of my front door. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a hunter had wandered too close, or someone was lost. But why would they come so close to the cabin without knocking? I decided to keep an eye out, but I didn't feel truly uneasy yet. A week later, I found the first sign that something wasn't right. I'd been working on carving a wooden chair, something to pass the time during the long nights. I left the unfinished piece on the workbench before going to bed. When I woke up the next morning, it had been moved. It wasn't a subtle shift. The chair had been turned completely around, facing the window. I tried to convince myself I'd done it absent-mindedly, but deep down, I knew I hadn't. The footprints outside were back, too. This time, they circled the cabin before disappearing into the trees. I started locking the door at night and keeping my hatchet within arm's reach. I told myself it was just a precaution, but every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, set my nerves on edge. By early February, I was barely sleeping. The sounds outside were more frequent, always at night, always just at the edge of my hearing. Sometimes, I thought I could make out faint breathing or the rustle of fabric. I'd shine my flashlight out the window, but the beam would only catch swirling snow and dark trees. One morning, I found my axe missing. It had been propped up against the side of the cabin the day before, but now it was gone. I searched the area, but there was no sign of it. The footprints were back, leading from the cabin to the forest. Whoever or whatever was out there was getting bolder. The final straw came a week later. I was splitting wood in the afternoon when I heard a loud crack from inside the cabin. It sounded like something heavy had fallen. My heart raced as I dropped the axe and ran inside. The workbench was overturned, tools scattered across the floor. The chair I'd been carving was missing. I stood there, trying to make sense of it, when I noticed the trapdoor to the crawlspace was slightly ajar. I hadn't touched that space since finishing the cabin. It was just a shallow area beneath the floorboards, barely big enough to crawl through. My stomach turned as I approached it. I grabbed a lantern and slowly opened the hatch. The smell hit me first, a rancid, earthy stench that made me gag. I shone the light inside and froze. The chair was there, along with my missing axe and several other items I hadn't realized were gone. A knife, a canteen, even one of my boots. But it wasn't the items that scared me. It was the bedroll shoved into the corner, along with a pile of crumpled wrappers and bones. Someone had been living under my cabin. I slammed the hatch shut and dragged the heaviest piece of furniture I could find on top of it. My hands were shaking as I bolted the door and started packing my things. I didn't care that it was snowing. I wasn't staying another night. I left that afternoon, hiking through the forest until I reached the nearest road. I flagged down a passing truck and explained as much as I could to the driver. By the time I returned with the authorities the next day, the cabin was empty. The hatch was open and the crawl space was cleared out. Whoever had been there was gone, leaving behind only the faint smell of decay and the footprints leading into the forest. I never went back to the cabin. Whatever peace I'd hoped to find in the woods had been shattered. Even now, years later, I can't help but glance over my shoulder whenever I'm alone, haunted by the thought that someone is watching, waiting, just out of sight. I never thought much about getting away from the city until my friend offered me his family's old cabin in the mountains. He said they rarely used it anymore and I was welcome to spend a weekend there. He assured me it was remote, quiet, and the perfect place to unwind. I was in my late 20s, living in a busy city, and overwhelmed with work, so it sounded perfect. It was late October, and the drive to the cabin took me deep into the mountains of North Carolina. The air grew colder, and the roads narrower as I climbed higher. The leaves had mostly fallen, leaving the trees bare and the landscape stark. By the time I reached the gravel driveway leading to the cabin, it was almost sunset. The cabin was modest, built decades ago, with faded wooden planks and a tin roof. It sat at the edge of a thick forest with a small clearing in front. A single dirt path led to a nearby stream I planned to check out later. There was no cell service, which made me nervous at first, but I told myself that was part of the charm. I unloaded my bag and a cooler of food, then stepped inside. The The interior was simple but cozy, with a small kitchen, a living room with a stone fireplace, and a single bedroom. It smelled faintly of wood and thyme. I found a stack of firewood outside and got a fire going to chase away the evening chill. That first night was uneventful. I made myself a quick dinner, read by the fire, and went to bed early. The quiet was almost unnerving after years of constant city noise, but I convinced myself it was just something I needed to get used to. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. I followed the dirt path to the stream, which was crystal clear and surrounded by mossy rocks. I walked along its edge for a while, enjoying the solitude. After about an hour, I stumbled upon what looked like an old campsite. There was a rusted fire pit and the remnants of a tattered tent. It didn't look like anyone had been there in years, but it gave me an uneasy feeling. I told myself it was nothing, just some old camping gear someone had abandoned long ago, and headed back to the cabin. The rest of the day passed quietly. I cooked, read, and chopped some wood for the fireplace. As night fell, I started to feel the isolation more acutely. The forest around the cabin was silent, apart from the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I brushed it off as paranoia and went to bed. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a sound outside. It was faint, like footsteps crunching on gravel. I froze, straining to hear more. The sound stopped, and all I could hear was my own heartbeat. I told myself it was probably just an animal and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next day, I noticed something odd. The firewood stack outside looked smaller than it had the day before. I had only taken a few logs, but at least half the pile was gone. I checked around the cabin, but there were no tracks or signs of anyone else. I told myself maybe I had overestimated how much wood there was to begin with. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, circling the cabin. I stayed in bed, too scared to move. After a while, they stopped, and I heard nothing else for the rest of the night. The next morning, I found more signs that someone, or something, had been around. The firewood stack was completely gone, and there were faint boot prints in the dirt near the front door. My first instinct was to pack up and leave, but I convinced myself it was just a local messing with me. I decided to stay one more night, but kept a kitchen knife nearby, just in case. As the sun set, I locked all the doors and windows and lit a fire in the fireplace. The hours dragged by, and I kept listening for any sounds outside. Around midnight, I heard a soft tapping on one of the windows. My heart raced as I sat frozen, staring at the glass. The tapping stopped, and I heard footsteps moving around the cabin. I grabbed the knife and moved to the kitchen, where I could see the front door and the back window. Suddenly, the doorknob rattled, and I heard someone trying to push it open. I shouted, hoping to scare them off, but the noise only stopped for a moment before starting again. The door held, and eventually the noise stopped. I waited in the kitchen for what felt like hours, knife in hand, until the first light of dawn appeared. As soon as it was bright enough, I packed my things and left the cabin. Driving down the mountain, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting someone to follow me. When I got home, I told my friend what had happened. He was shocked but said he hadn't been to the cabin in years and had no idea who could have been there. I never went back, and to this day I wonder who or what was outside that cabin. Whatever it was, it knew I was alone, and that thought still keeps me awake some nights. I woke up to the sound of rain hitting the roof of the cabin. It wasn't a light drizzle. It was a heavy, steady downpour, the kind that made everything outside seem distant and blurred. The rain drummed against the roof in uneven patterns, some drops hitting harder than others, creating a sound that was both calming and unsettling. I could hear it trickling down the windows and pooling around the uneven ground outside. It had been raining for hours, maybe all night, but I hadn't noticed until the noise pulled me from sleep. The room was dark except for the faint gray light filtering through the thin curtains. I sat up slowly, my body stiff from the cheap mattress. My phone was on the nightstand, the screen lighting up as I tapped it. No signal. That wasn't surprising. I was in the middle of nowhere, deep in a forest in northern Montana, miles away from the nearest town. I had come out here to escape, to clear my head after a stressful year. It was late September 2022, and the air was already starting to turn cold. The cabin wasn't anything fancy, just a single room with a small kitchenette, a fireplace, and a bed pushed up against the far wall. The walls were wooden, rough-hewn, and the place smelled faintly of damp wood and old smoke. There was no running water, just a pump outside, and the electricity was powered by a small generator that I'd shut off the night before to save fuel. It was quiet except for the rain, the kind of silence that felt too complete, like the world had pressed pause on everything else. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my bare feet hitting the cold wooden floor. I shivered, pulling the thin blanket around my shoulders as I shuffled toward the window. Outside, the forest was a blur of wet green and brown, the trees swaying slightly in the wind. The rain made everything look slick and shiny, like the world was coated in glass. I could see my car parked a few yards away, half hidden by the tall grass that grew around the cabin. The thought of stepping outside in that weather made me hesitate. I hadn't planned much for this trip, just a few days to myself, away from people, away from noise. I'd brought enough food to last me a week and some books to keep me entertained. I told myself it was a chance to reset, to remind myself of who I was without the constant hum of emails, phone calls, and city noise. But now, standing there in the dim light with the rain pouring down, I felt a strange sense of unease. I couldn't put my finger on why. The rain showed no signs of stopping, so I decided to light a fire. I crouched by the fireplace, arranging the logs and kindling I'd gathered the day before. My hands worked mechanically, and within minutes I had a small flame growing. The warmth was immediate, a welcome relief from the cold air. I sat down in the single armchair by the fire, pulling the blanket tighter around me. As I stared into the flames, my mind wandered. Something about the rain felt wrong, though I couldn't explain it. It wasn't the rain itself, it was how it seemed to absorb all other sounds. The forest, usually alive with the rustling of leaves, chirping birds, and distant animal calls, was completely silent. The only noise was the rain, relentless and steady. Hours passed, or at least it felt that way. The fire crackled softly, the rain drummed on, and I let myself drift in and out of thought. At some point, I must have dozed off, because when I opened my eyes, the light from the fire had dimmed, and the room was even darker than before. The rain was still falling, heavier now, the sound almost deafening. I stood up, stretching, and walked to the door. I thought about stepping outside to feel the rain on my skin, to remind myself I wasn't entirely cut off from the world. But when I reached for the door handle, a strange sensation stopped me. It wasn't fear exactly, it was more like a gut instinct, a feeling that something wasn't right. My hand hovered over the handle for a moment before I pulled it back. Instead, I went to check on the generator. I grabbed my flashlight from the kitchen counter, the beam cutting through the dimness as I stepped into the small back room where the generator was stored. It was quiet, too quiet, and when I flipped the switch, nothing happened. I frowned, tapping the side of the machine, but it didn't respond. I checked it the day before, and it had been working fine. Now, though it was completely dead, I felt a flicker of frustration, but it quickly gave way to that same nagging unease. The air felt heavier, like the atmosphere in the room had changed. I told myself I was overthinking it, that the generator was old and probably just needed some maintenance. But deep down, I wasn't convinced. Back in the main room, I added more wood to the fire and tried to shake off the feeling. I told myself to relax, to focus on the simplicity of being alone in the wilderness. But every time I glanced at the window, the rain seemed darker, heavier, almost unnatural. Then I noticed something odd. The car, which had been visible from the window earlier, was now partially obscured. At first, I thought it was just the rain making it hard to see, but as I looked closer, I realized there was something else. Branches. Large, broken branches had fallen over the car, covering part of the roof and hood. I hadn't heard them fall, which was strange given how heavy they looked. My pulse quickened as I stared at the car, my breath fogging up the glass. I felt exposed, like someone or something was watching me. The logical part of my brain tried to push the thought away, to remind me that I was alone out here. But the feeling wouldn't go away. Hours stretched into what felt like days, and I stayed by the fire, the blanket pulled tightly around me. The rain didn't stop, not even for a moment. It was as if the storm was endless, an unrelenting force pressing down on the cabin. It was when I heard the first sound, something distinct from the rain, that I knew I wasn't alone. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it was there. A soft crunch, like footsteps on wet ground. My body tensed, every muscle locking into place. I turned toward the window, but all I could see was the rain-slicked glass reflecting the firelight. For the next few hours, I stayed in the armchair, my eyes darting between the window and the door. I didn't sleep. I barely moved. The footsteps came and went, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always there. By morning, when the rain finally began to ease, I was too afraid to leave the cabin. When I finally stepped outside later that afternoon, the forest was eerily still. The air was cold and smelled of wet earth. I walked to the car, brushing the branches away, and that's when I saw them. Footprints, large, deep, and leading away into the trees. I didn't stay to find out who or what had been there. By the time the sun set again, I was already miles away, driving back to the city as fast as the muddy roads would allow. That trip was supposed to help me find peace. Instead, it left me with a question I couldn't answer. Who was out there, watching, waiting, and why didn't they come inside?